What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about the 20th anniversary of the Divinity universe, and also the 5th year since Divinity Original Sin 2 itself launched. I love the Divinity series. I have covered it extensively. A lot of videos on this channel are actually lore and story videos about the Divinity universe and all of the games, etc. Now, unfortunately, I kind of just ran out of things to talk about, because as you might have noticed, they haven't exactly done anything with the franchise in quite some time, as the studio has been working on Baldur's Gate 3. So today I thought it would be fun to kind of celebrate the anniversary, if you will, by talking a bit about the Divinity universe as a whole, the fact that the entire Divinity series is on a deep discount this week. You can pick up a few of the original games for like 60 cents, and Original Sin 2 is 65% off, and you can grab it for like $15. But first, a little reminiscing of my own experience with Divinity and how I kind of fell in love with it and started covering the entire series before the channel even started to really take off. In fact, before Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, a significant amount of what I did was cover the Divinity universe. Like a lot of people, I had actually not heard about it until Divinity Original Sin 2, and I loved that game so much because it reminded me of a lot of CRPGs that I used to play, albeit with a bit more of a modern take. And then, in the course of playing the game, I found out that this was actually the 6th game in the entire series, and I was like, I need to know everything there is to know about this series so I can talk about it, quite frankly. And I did exactly that. I dove in, starting with the first game, and then kind of worked my way through them in the order in which they were released. However, the chronological order in terms of their continuity is all over the place. For those who are unaware, Divinity Original Sin 2 takes place actually about 60 years before the farthest along in the timeline game, which is actually Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, which was a sort of Eurojank third-person action RPG that was released some time ago. But as I was moving through these games to learn more about the series as a whole, one thing did become very clear, and Larian themselves have stated this previously, but they didn't really start caring about the broad picture of the lore until Original Sin 2. And because of that, if you look closely enough, there are a lot of plot holes and issues here and there. Honestly, nothing that I don't think more writing, now that they care about the lore in their own words, couldn't fix, but there are little plot holes here and there. So as much as I enjoy the series, its lore could use a brush up, frankly. Just to give one example from Original Sin 2, actually, is Alexander, Lucian's son. Presumably grew up alongside Damien. However, there were novels released about the plot here and there, and there is a novel in which we learn about Lucian raising Damien, and Alexander is never mentioned. He was thrown into Original Sin 2 for the plot, and then never explained at all in terms of the past games. Now, I've made a video talking about some theories behind that, and again, it's nothing that couldn't be fixed with more writing, but there's things like that all throughout the series, so the lore is a bit all over the place. But from here, I want to talk about kind of each game individually and whether or not I think it's worth playing, and we're going to do that in the order in which they were released. Starting with Divine Divinity. Divine Divinity actually takes place roughly 30 years before Original Sin 2, and in it, you actually play as Lucian canonically. However, we don't know this at the time. However, Divine Divinity is an amazing hidden gem. This is a game I actually recommend to just about everybody if you can get past the fact that it's quite old. It's a 20-year-old game that, quite frankly, just didn't age very well. And that's largely thanks to modern hardware. It's not impossible to get this game to run. There are a handful of mods that can help you out. But while this game, if you can actually play it, is amazing, it's very difficult to get it to run. Getting it to run just to do the story videos and everything was very difficult. And even if you can get it to run, there's no like UI scaling or anything, so a lot of it's hard to read. There are bugs that can kind of brick a save, which I got around by using a hex editor to fix the saves. It was a lot of work. However, in spite of those things, I still think people should check Divine Divinity out. That's how good of a game it was. It's actually sort of this weird mix of Diablo-like meets sort of grand RPG. It's an open world, you're kind of free to explore. There is, of course, a story that revolves around Lucian ascending to the position of divine, and we kind of see that happen in real time. And then this is also where Damien comes into the story for the first time. Because if you've only played Original Sin 2, you have have no idea about any of this, but when Damien was a baby, Lucian saved him from being murdered by a demon to bring about the avatar of Chaos, the demon god. However, he wasn't successful in time, and Damien still took on a piece of the Chaos god anyway, but Lucian couldn't bring himself to kill him. Overall, fantastic game. Very old though, kind of hard to get it to run, but honestly, that game was so far ahead of its time. I would actually love for something like that to be released now. And in some ways, it was actually kind of more ambitious than Original Sin 2 was. Despite this strange stroke of genius, if you will, it was nonetheless followed up with a truly kind of terrible game, and that is Beyond Divinity. Beyond Divinity is the next game chronologically, and it focuses on a very important historical event, and in case you didn't read the spoiler message on screen at the start of the video, big spoilers here. Through a novel, we learn that Damien grew up, had this piece of chaos in him. It led to a war with Lucian. I'm paraphrasing here, there's a lot more than this going on, but Lucian ultimately banishes Damien to Nemesis. Beyond Divinity takes place in Nemesis, which is a realm controlled by demons. It's not where they're from. That's a realm called Tartarus. Nemesis is just a realm they control, and they took it over from a species called the Renar. But Beyond Divinity centers around Damien's escape from Nemesis because Lucian essentially trapped him there. However, it was possible through a loophole for him to escape, which is the plot of Beyond Divinity. Now, I'm going to be honest with you though, outside that premise that actually sounds pretty cool, Beyond Divinity is just a bad game. It's terribly paced, the skill system is absolutely atrocious, and it's not a game I would recommend anybody play. If anything, I'd recommend you watch my story video for Beyond Divinity just to kind of get the gist of the plot, because it's not worth playing. Now that brings us to Divinity 2, or as you'll sometimes hear it referred to, the Dragon Knight Saga. This is a game that I often see a little bit of confusion about because it's called Divinity 2, and people think when you say Divinity 2, you're talking about Divinity Original Sin 2, but there is a difference. But given the popularity of Original Sin 2, it's not exactly surprising why this happened. Divinity 2 was, again, a third-person action RPG that takes place way in the future, actually. About 70 years or so after Beyond Divinity, and about 60 or so years after Divinity Original Sin 2. This is the game that, in terms of the timeline, is the farthest out. And overall, pretty cool. It deals with Lucian and Damien and some things going on there, and it carried forward the Chaos plotline, which is probably the most interesting thing, in my opinion, about the Divinity universe, but it's not something that really came up in Original Sin 2. It looked like it was going to be part of the canceled game, or at least shelved game, Divinity Fallen Heroes, but we don't see much of it here. In Divinity 2, you play the role of a Dragon Knight, which is different from being an actual dragon, but it is a humanoid who can turn into a dragon, and we save the realm by saving Lucian. And it's thanks to Divinity 2 we can make some inferences about the canonical ending of Divinity Original Sin 2. However, I don't think it's terribly unlikely if they were to make a Divinity 3 to just completely scrap the Divinity 2 plotline. I think it would be a shame if they did that because, again, this is plot I would like to see personally continued. However, from a business perspective, I can see why they would just scrap Divinity 2 and say it never happened and take the story in a new place now that it's gained all this popularity. But nonetheless, Divinity 2 I do think is a game worth playing. It did some curious things with dragon combat because you can actually turn into a dragon in the game, and they kind of wove that combat into it a little bit. But as third-person action RPGs go, it's pretty good. There's stuff you wouldn't expect, ways to solve quests you wouldn't expect. Again, you can fly around as a dragon in parts of the game, which is pretty cool by itself. You get a sort of hub area to work out of. And it's a game that's showing its age, but honestly, it's still pretty fun, even if it's definitely kind of janky. Now that brings us to the fourth game, and that is Divinity Dragon Commander. This is a weird one on the list, to be honest with you, and that is because Dragon Commander is significantly different than the rest of the series. It attempts to be a sort of real-time strategy mixed with like Risk, and it's kind of a strange one. Again, more of an RTS where you command a unit, which is usually a dragon. You play a dragon knight in this one as well, but typically speaking, you play as a dragon. And you kind of command real-time strategy battles, like from overhead as you're flying around as a dragon, and then you can interact and fight the battles and stuff. And in between this, the story would take place on the Raven, which is your sort of command ship. A very interesting premise. But the thing about Dragon Commander is that despite all of the high technology going on, this particular game takes place about 8,800 years before Divinity Original Sin, which that game takes place about 1,200 years before Divine Divinity, which means Dragon Commander takes place about 10,000 years before Divine Divinity does. And we see a truly great civilization using all this technology, but it's brought to ruin and war by the usual stuff, demons and magic. However, at the end of the game, they sort of get away with this in the plot by having all of the technology wiped out as a sort of plot contrivance more than anything. But nonetheless, a game that carried forth the lore a little bit. This is the game that we actually start seeing some of the races a little more fleshed out in terms of their lore and what goes into like their day-to-day lives, such as the undead, for instance. And it's an interesting game. I don't think you really need to play it, to be honest with you. It doesn't have that much to do with the rest of the series. However, this is kind of the format they were taking for Fallen Heroes before it got shelved, so you might want to check it out for that reason. But this, of course, brings us to the newer stuff, Divinity Original Sin 1 and Divinity Original Sin 2, which is where Larian Studios finally managed to hit their stride. Now, Divinity Original Sin 1, like a lot of their games, didn't have too much to do with Divinity Original Sin 2. The plots are largely separated, they just primarily revolve around Source, which is why they share a name, as Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2 have plots that are centered around Source and its effects on the world. Now, Source itself was actually mentioned all the way back in Divine Divinity in sort of a side quest, and it certainly wasn't used the way that it was in this game. Now, I liked Divinity Original Sin 1 quite a bit. I do think Original Sin 2 managed to take a lot of the systems at play and refine them, but there are things that I think Original Sin 1 did better. For instance, Original Sin 1 is actually a bit more of an open world. Now, unfortunately, this world is sort of level gated. There are maps you can actually find of the levels of each area, which is kind of the recommended way to tackle quests. So while it's technically open world, it kind of doesn't really feel that way because you are kind of pigeonholed into doing things in a certain order. But nonetheless, you can kind of freely roam the map until the end of the game. Technically, it's divided up into 3 areas that load separately, but you're free to wander, basically, which I liked quite a bit, and that's something that I would have liked to see in Divinity Original Sin 2, because you do have big maps that you can wander around, but you can't move to and from, basically. You're in those maps for an act, and then you move on, and you can't go back. Well, in Original Sin 1, you could go back. You could go check stuff out and explore, and I thought that was cool. Now, probably the best things that happened between Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2 are the system refinements. The core of the system is the same, but they moved a lot of the systems around, made the stats easier to understand, and overall, Original Sin 2 just plays a lot better than Original Sin 1. Which, of course, brings us to Original Sin 2. Obviously, I think everyone should play this game. I think it's incredible. It definitely has its faults. It's certainly not a perfect game, but I do think it's really, really good. And if by some strange reasoning you're watching this and haven't played it, definitely check it out. But Original Sin 2, I think, was Larian finally being able to make the game that they wanted to make. They clearly went through a lot of iteration, trying different things, and finally landed with Original Sin 2, which I think does reactivity really, really well. The choices you make can be a little touch and go. A lot of the story plays out the same regardless, so it's kind of how you get to those story bits that changes. And the game does a really good job of reacting to the things that you're doing. But when you actually look at things, you're not really making that many choices. There are some in terms of the plot, is what I'm referring to specifically, as the plot part of the game actually plays out pretty much the same kind of no matter what you do. However, you do have a lot of choice in how you approach things. And again, the game is very good at reacting to how you did things, but you still kind of arrive at the same plot points no matter what, which I think is honestly the best thing about Original Sin 2. That is a game that does a fantastic job of letting the player play the game without managing to ever really break anything. Now, there are still absolutely things you can take advantage of. The weight system is still hilariously broken, which carried over from Original Sin 1. And as a game, the sort of design philosophy that Larian explained that they approached here was allowing you to do whatever without breaking the game, but because of this, there's not really a lot of consequences to anything you do either. For instance, before you leave one act, you can basically go kill like whole towns if you want, just for the experience and the loot, and it doesn't really affect anything later, which is a bit of a bummer, but like I said, the game's not perfect. It is, however, an incredible game. But that's pretty much all I've got for you guys. I just kind of wanted to take some time to talk about the Divinity series on its 20th anniversary and kind of some general thoughts about each game. However, if there's any topic you want more information about, I've probably made a lore video about it. I've made a story series for literally the entirety of every game. So if you want to know more and you don't have the time to play these games, even at their steep discounts right now, chances are I've made a video about it. Like I said, I kind of just ran out of things to talk about, which is why I don't talk too much about Divinity today, which brings me to my last point. I'm excited for BG3. I think Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be fun. I think I'm going to have a lot of content to make about it, quite frankly. But for me personally, as someone who really loves the Divinity series, the success of BG3 also has me worried about the future of the Divinity series, because quite frankly, I would like another Divinity game at some point. More specifically, I would love to see them continue the plot around chaos and the demon god and kind of see a lot of that stuff elaborated on and taken care of. And furthermore, I'd love to see what lessons they can learn from Baldur's Gate 3 and Divinity Original Sin 2 to put into a Divinity 3. I think it could be really cool, but obviously I have no idea what form that would take. But in terms of the Divinity series as a whole, I guess more than anything, I'm curious if they're going to continue working on it. I certainly hope so, as it's a really fantastic universe, and it would be a shame to see it not get any more releases, basically. But there's everything I've got for you guys on the Divinity series. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.